At first, the two professors laughed until this Muslim student left them both embarrassed. Welcome to the Guided Flame. If you want our hard work to bring you more amazing videos, then please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your likes and comments mean a lot to us. The seminar hall at a prestigious university in Honduras was filled with students and academics attending the annual scientific discussion. The atmosphere was serious and intellectual, with scholars eagerly anticipating the discourse. Among the prominent speakers were two senior professors, Dr. Eaton Walls and Dr. Richard Alvarez, both well-known secular scientists. They were particularly critical of religion, especially Islam, and often used academic forums to question and even belittle religious values in front of their students. That day, they had chosen a highly controversial theme: the role of religion in modern civilization. Is it still relevant? During his presentation, Dr. Eaton mockingly discussed Islamic celebrations, particularly the Islamic New Year and the Nuzul Quran, dismissing them as unscientific myths. Look at how rapidly the world is advancing with science and technology. Yet some people still believe that a book revealed centuries ago can be a source of knowledge. The Islamic New Year, Nuzul Quran, these are just outdated traditions with no relevance in today's modern world. His words echoed through the hall. Some students nodded in agreement, while others appeared uncomfortable. Among them was a Muslim student, Hazel Ramirez, known for her intelligence and sharp analytical mind. Sitting with her notebook in hand, she listened intently, her gaze fixed on the two professors. To her, this was more than just an academic discussion. It was an opportunity to defend Islam in front of the academic community. When the floor was opened for questions, Hazel confidently raised her hand. The atmosphere in the room shifted. All eyes turned toward her, and some students whispered among themselves, curious to see how a Muslim student would respond to two professors known for their sharp arguments. "This is the moment I've been waiting for," Hazel muttered to herself as she stood up, adjusted her posture, and looked directly at Dr. Eaton and Dr. Richard. "Good afternoon, professors. My name is Hazel Ramirez, a final-year student majoring in philosophy and religious studies. Thank you for your interesting presentation. However, I would like to ask a fundamental question." Some students took out their phones, sensing that this was about to become a heated debate. "I heard you both state that the Islamic New Year and Nuzul Quran are irrelevant traditions in the modern era. My question is, on what basis do you conclude that something which cannot be measured by scientific instruments is automatically worthless?" Dr. Eaton smirked and shrugged dismissively. "Ah, a classic argument from someone who still believes in supernatural things. Science only recognizes what can be empirically proven. Traditions such as the Islamic New Year or the revelation of religious scriptures are merely narratives passed down through generations without scientific evidence." Hazel nodded slightly, as if she had anticipated this response. "All right then, let's approach this from a purely scientific perspective. You are both scientists, so you must acknowledge that modern science recognizes dimensions beyond what is directly observable. Correct?" Dr. Richard, who had remained silent so far, leaned forward with interest. "Of course. In quantum physics, we understand that there are many realities that we cannot fully explain." Hazel's eyes gleamed. "Interesting. So you admit that there are dimensions that cannot always be observed with the naked eye but are still acknowledged by science?" "Yes, but that is different," Dr. Eaton interrupted quickly. "Science, at the very least, attempts to understand these dimensions through systematic methods, not mere belief." Hazel smiled. "And that is exactly my point. Islam is not based on baseless beliefs. The Quran itself has discussed numerous scientific concepts long before modern science discovered them. Take, for example, the embryonic development process in the womb, the water cycle, even the expansion of the universe. If Islam were just a set of ancient traditions, How could a book revealed over 1,400 years ago contain such precise scientific information? The room fell silent. Some students exchanged glances, whispering among themselves. Hazel's argument was logical and difficult to refute. Dr. Richard tapped his fingers on the table, deep in thought. "Well," he finally said, "if Islam truly aligns with scientific knowledge, then why do we still see many Muslims rejecting science in favor of religious dogma? That, I believe, is the real issue." Hazel responded without hesitation. "Professor, there is a difference between Islamic teachings and the practices of some of its followers. If there are Muslims who reject science, it is not because of Islam itself, but because of their lack of understanding. In reality, Islam strongly encourages the pursuit of knowledge. Didn't Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, say, 'Seeking knowledge is an obligation upon every Muslim'?" Dr. Eaton shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The discussion had taken an unexpected turn. Dr. Richard hadn't expected such a structured and scientifically backed argument from a student, let alone a female student. But the debate was now taking a different turn, and it was being steered by the topic of rituals, like the Islamic calendar. He smiled slightly, as if preparing for his counterpoint. Hazel, however, was already a step ahead. "Professor, let's talk about history," she said firmly. "You certainly know that the Gregorian calendar is a legacy of the Roman calendar system, and it has undergone multiple revisions before becoming what it is today, but no one questions its relevance." Dr. Richard leaned forward, intrigued. "Of course," he admitted, "because it is a system based on astronomical calculations." Hazel nodded. "Exactly. And the same applies to the Islamic calendar," she replied. "The Hijri calendar is based on the movement of the moon, which is also a part of astronomical science. There is nothing unscientific about it. In fact, Islamic astronomical calculations have historically played a major role in the development of modern science." The room grew lively. Some students, who had been passive spectators until now, began nodding in agreement. A few whispered to each other in admiration. Dr. Eaton quickly attempted to steer the discussion in another direction. "But these religious rituals still remain," he said, trying to interrupt. Hazel didn't falter. "Let me explain," she said calmly. "Nuzul Quran is not just a celebration of the revelation of a holy book. It is a moment of reflection, a time to remember that knowledge and wisdom are integral to this religion. And if we are discussing this from a scientific perspective, there is actual research that proves reading the Quran has a calming effect on the brain. Studies show that listening to its recitation can activate alpha waves, which are associated with relaxation and increased concentration." Dr. Eaton and Dr. Richard fell silent. Hazel wasn't just making claims, she was backing them with data and scientific reasoning. A wave of applause spread through the hall. The students, realizing that one of their own had just turned the debate on its head, began to look at her with newfound respect. Dr. Richard finally smiled a thin, reluctant smile. "You're quite smart, Hazel," he admitted. "I didn't expect such a strong answer from a student." Hazel simply smiled back, knowing that she had successfully made her point. This debate was far from over. She glanced at the two professors, her expression calm. She could see that her argument had shaken them, but she also knew they wouldn't give up so easily. The room was still filled with anticipation, students waiting to see how the discussion would unfold. Dr. Eaton crossed his arms, trying to mask the discomfort on his face. "All right, Hazel, you speak convincingly, but let's take this further. If Islam is truly a religion that prioritizes science and rationality, then why is it that so many Muslim-majority countries are lagging behind in science and technology?" Some students thought this would be a tough blow for Hazel. They turned to her, curious to see how she would respond. But Hazel simply smiled, unfazed. She had anticipated this question. "Professor," she said in a measured tone, Do you believe that the problems in the Muslim world today are caused by the teachings of Islam itself, or are they the result of other factors, politics, economics, and the impact of colonial history? Dr. Richard raised an eyebrow. He hadn't expected her to flip the question back at him. Hazel continued. If we look at history, Islamic civilization was once the center of global scientific progress. When Europe was in the Dark Ages, Muslim scholars like Ibn Sina, al-Khwarizmi, and al-Biruni wrote works that became the foundation of modern science, medicine, mathematics, and astronomy. All of these flourished in the Muslim world. But then came colonialism, political divisions, and external interventions, which led to the decline of Muslim nations. Dr. Eaton let out a long sigh. So, you're blaming colonialism and politics for the Muslim world's decline? He asked, sounding almost annoyed. Hazel shook her head. Not blaming, understanding. It would be unfair to judge the current state of Muslim nations without considering how they got here. If we are being academically honest, we must consider all historical factors rather than making shallow conclusions. The students whispered among themselves again. Some looked genuinely amazed at how Hazel was dismantling the arguments with logic and historical facts. Dr. Richard tapped his fingers on the table, deep in thought. He realized that this debate was not going in the direction he had planned. "All right," he said, "I can accept that history plays a role, but let's talk about today. You speak of Islam's past glory, but what about now? Why is there not a single Muslim country that can match Western nations in technological innovation?" Hazel's gaze sharpened. "Professor, are you absolutely sure about that statement?" "Yes," Dr. Richard replied confidently. "So you've never heard of modern Muslim scientists like Dr. Yusuf Al-Tayyar, a pioneer in biotechnology, or Dr. Ali Japan, a leading physicist?" Hazel challenged. The room fell silent. All eyes were on Dr. Richard. He hesitated. Hazel smiled to herself. The discussion wasn't over yet. "Who invented the helium neon laser? Or perhaps you've heard of Ahmed Zewail, a Muslim scientist who won the Nobel Prize in chemistry." Dr. Richard fell silent. He hadn't anticipated that Hazel would provide a list of Muslim scientists who had made significant contributions to modern science. "Professor," Hazel continued, "just because the media does not emphasize these scientific achievements does not mean they do not exist. The Muslim world has many brilliant scientists, but often they must work in Western countries due to a lack of support in their own homelands. The issue is not Islam, but rather the policies and systems that have not maximized the potential for scientific development." The students erupted in applause once again. Many of them were beginning to realize that some of their previous assumptions were not entirely accurate. Dr. Eaton shook his head, this time with a faint smile. "I admit you are very skilled at constructing arguments," he said, "but I still have one important question." "Of course, Professor," Hazel replied calmly. "If Islam is truly a religion that prioritizes science, then why do many Muslims still believe in mystical superstitions? Doesn't that contradict the rationality you've been advocating for?" Several students nodded in agreement. Hazel understood that this was a sensitive issue, but she remained composed. "Professor," Hazel began, "let me—" Hazel asked a counter-question. "Do you think every scientist is always rational in everything they believe?" Dr. Eaton chuckled. "Of course not. Even in academia, there are those who hold beliefs that defy logic." "Exactly," Hazel said with a smile. "The same applies in Islam. Not all Muslims fully understand their faith. Many mix cultural beliefs with the pure teachings of Islam, but that is not Islam's fault. It is a result of a lack of proper understanding. In reality, Islam strictly forbids superstitions that contradict logic and reason. The Quran repeatedly urges people to think, reflect, and use their intellect. Islam does not ask us to believe in anything without strong reasoning." Dr. Richard appeared to be deep in thought. Though he might not openly admit it, it was clear that he no longer took Hazel's arguments lightly. Meanwhile, students who had remained silent up to this point began raising their hands. One student from the back row spoke up. "Hazel, may I ask something?" "Of course," Hazel responded. The student hesitated for a moment before continuing. "I'm not a Muslim, but I want to understand. If Islam is truly a rational religion, then why does it have rules that seem to restrict individual freedom?" Hazel nodded. "That is a very good question. Could you give me an example of the kind of rule you're referring to?" The student thought for a moment. "For instance, why are Muslims prohibited from drinking alcohol? Isn't that a personal choice?" Hazel smiled. "All right, let's examine this from a scientific perspective. Are you aware that modern research has proven that alcohol damages the brain and nervous system? Numerous medical studies associate alcohol with severe diseases such as cancer and liver disorders." The student nodded. "Yes, I've read about that." "Well," Hazel continued, "Islam forbids alcohol not to restrict personal freedom, but to protect human beings from its scientifically proven harm. Think of it like a doctor advising a patient to avoid certain foods because they are detrimental to health. Islam provides guidelines not to limit people, but to safeguard them from destruction." The room fell silent again. The student who had asked the question seemed deep in thought. Dr. Eaton let out a long breath. "I didn't expect this discussion to go this far," he admitted, leaning back in his chair. Dr. Richard nodded in agreement. "Yes, this is far more in-depth than I anticipated." Hazel remained calm. She knew that the debate was not over yet. There was still much more to discuss, and she was prepared to continue. The tension in the room lingered as the student who had asked the question remained quiet, processing Hazel's response. Meanwhile, Dr. Eaton and Dr. Richard exchanged glances, seemingly searching for a way to challenge Hazel once more. Before either professor could speak, another student hesitantly raised her hand. She appeared unsure at first, but after receiving an encouraging nod from Hazel, she found the courage to speak. "I apologize if this is a bit personal," she began, "but I'm curious. Why are you so certain that Islam is the truth? What makes you so confident that you can stand here and debate two professors?" Once again, the room fell silent. This was no longer just a debate about history or science. This question directly challenged Hazel's personal convictions. Hazel exhaled slowly and looked at the student with a gentle gaze. "That's a good question," she said. "I could give you an academic answer, but since you've asked about my personal beliefs, let me answer honestly." She then turned to face the entire room. Every student, every professor, everyone was listening intently. "I believe in Islam not only because of the logical arguments we have discussed, but because Islam answers the most fundamental questions in my life. Why are we here? What is our purpose? And where do we go after we die?" Some of the students looked stunned. These were questions that often cross people's minds, but few dared to truly seek the answers. Hazel continued, "Since childhood, I have always wondered about the meaning of life. I grew up in an academic environment that emphasized science and logic, but I felt like something was missing. Science can explain how the universe works, but it cannot answer the question of why we are here." Dr. Richard looked interested. "So you found that answer in Islam?" he asked skeptically. Hazel nodded. "Yes. Islam teaches that life is not a coincidence but part of a grand plan. In the Quran, Allah says that humans were created to worship Him and to live a meaningful life. Islam offers not only moral codes but also guidance on how to live with a clear purpose." Dr. Eaton leaned back in his chair. "But doesn't every religion claim to have the truth? What makes Islam different?" Hazel smiled. "That is the question I once asked myself. I studied various philosophies and religions before truly understanding Islam. What makes Islam different is how it provides a balance between logic, spirituality, and the laws of life. The Quran is not only a holy book, but also full of verses that challenge humans to think and reflect. Allah repeatedly says, "Do they not think? Do they not reflect?" There is no blind doctrine in Islam. Everything must be based on knowledge and understanding, not mere cultural inheritance. The students began to whisper among themselves. Many of them had always considered religion as something dogmatic, but Hazel's explanation made them reconsider. Dr. Richard sighed. "I admit, the argument is quite interesting, but what about the concept of God in Islam? Why must there be a God? Hasn't science explained the origins of the universe with the Big Bang Theory and evolution?" Hazel smiled thinly. She had anticipated this question. "Professor, let's start with the Big Bang. This theory states that the universe had a beginning, that at some point, an immense expansion occurred, giving birth to space, time, and matter." Dr. Richard nodded. "Yes, that's a widely accepted theory in the scientific community. Continue." "If the universe had a beginning," Hazel said, "then something must have caused it. It is impossible for something to come from nothing. In science, the law of cause and effect is a fundamental principle. So, the question is, what was the initial cause of everything?" The room fell silent. This was a difficult question to answer without introducing metaphysics. Hazel continued. "Scientists like Stephen Hawking tried to explain that the universe could have come into existence due to laws of physics, like gravity, but that does not answer the main question. Where did those laws come from? Why does the law of gravity exist? Why is there order in the universe? If there is no governing force, there should be only chaos." Dr. Eaton smiled sarcastically. "So, you conclude that God is the answer to everything science can explain?" Hazel shook her head. "No, Professor. I'm not saying that God is a substitute for science. On the contrary, the existence of God explains why science can exist. Why are there consistent laws of nature? Why is there causation in the mechanics of the universe? Even many great scientists like Isaac Newton, Albert Einstein, and Max Planck realized that behind all this there must be a higher intelligence." Dr. Richard seemed to ponder this. He could not deny that many great scientists in the past had spiritual beliefs. Before he could respond, another student raised their hand. "If God exists and Islam is the true religion, why is there so much suffering in the world? Why does God let good people suffer?" This was a question often used to challenge one's beliefs. Hazel sighed. "This is a very deep question, and I will not give a simple answer. But let's look at this from a broader perspective." She looked at the student intently. "Imagine if we lived in a world without suffering. No pain, no loss, no hardship. Do you think humans would develop?" The student was silent. Hazel continued. "In real life, humans grow through challenges. People who never face hardships will not become strong. An athlete must go through hard training to become a champion. A scientist must face many failures before finding a new breakthrough. Likewise, in life, God gives tests not because He is cruel, but because that is how humans develop." Another student interrupted. "But what about children who die of starvation or war? That is not just a test, it is a tragedy." Hazel nodded. "I will not deny that this world is full of injustice, but much of that suffering is not because of God. It is because of human actions. War, exploitation, poverty, all of these are results of greed and injustice committed by humans. God has given humans the freedom to choose, and unfortunately, many abuse that freedom." The room fell silent again. Even Dr. Eaton and Dr. Richard were contemplating Hazel's words. Hazel then said in a softer voice, "But behind all suffering, there is always hope. Islam teaches that this world is temporary, and that true justice will be in the afterlife. No goodness is in vain, no suffering goes unrewarded. Allah never oppresses His servants." Several students bowed their heads, deep in thought. Dr. Richard finally took a deep breath. "I didn't think this discussion would go this far," he said in a calmer voice. Dr. Eaton added, "I also didn't think a student could argue with two professors like this." Hazel smiled. She knew that this debate was not over, but she had planted a thought that would continue to echo in their minds. The room felt different now. The long debate, once filled with sharp arguments and skepticism, had settled into deep contemplation. The mocking laughter and excessive cynicism from the professors had faded, and even the students were more silent, reflecting on every word that had been spoken. Dr. Richard, who had initially questioned Hazel's beliefs, with skepticism now replaced by a more composed demeanor, Dr. Richard leaned back in his chair, looking at Hazel with an expression no longer filled with challenge, but with sincere interest. "I have to admit something," he said after a while. "I came to this discussion with the assumption that a student could not possibly argue against two professors on a topic like this, but you proved me wrong." Hazel smiled. "I'm not trying to win or defeat anyone, Professor. I just want to convey what I believe in a scientific and rational way." Dr. Eaton, who had been the most vocal in questioning Islam, now looked at Hazel with a softer expression. He tapped his fingers on the table, deep in thought, before finally saying, "I'm still not sure about Islam, but I can't deny that many of your arguments make sense." Hazel nodded. She did not expect instant change from anyone. She knew that belief was not something that could be forced in a discussion. The most important thing was to open the door for those who genuinely wanted to seek the truth. One of the students, who had been silent the entire time, hesitantly raised his hand. "I want to ask something," he said quietly. "Go ahead," Hazel responded. "All this time, I thought of religion as something inherited from parents, but after hearing everything you've said, I am beginning to wonder, how does one seek the truth in religion?" Hazel looked at him attentively. "That is the question we should all ask ourselves. Do not believe in something just because others say it is true. Seek evidence, study, and reflect with an honest heart." She continued, "Islam does not ask us to believe blindly. Allah repeatedly invites humans to think and seek the truth with knowledge. In the Quran, Allah says, 'Then do they not reflect upon the Quran?' Of course, they will find many contradictions in it, but as the Quran states in Surah An-Nisa 4:82, do they not reflect upon the Quran? Had it been from anyone other than Allah, they would have certainly found in it many inconsistencies. If we sincerely seek the truth, we will realize that there are no contradictions in Islam. Everything it teaches has a logical foundation and aligns with the reality of life." The student nodded slowly, deep in thought. Meanwhile, Dr. Richard took a deep breath before speaking again. "All right, Hazel, I won't argue any further today, but I have one last question." "Of course, Professor," Hazel replied. "What should someone do if they want to understand Islam better but have many doubts?" Hazel offered a small smile. "I would say, don't be afraid to ask and seek knowledge for yourself. Don't rely on biased sources or the opinions of those who already hold negative views. Instead, study the Quran, read its translation, and try to understand its teachings. If needed, discuss with people who have a deep understanding of Islam, rather than those who only aim to criticize." She looked around at the students, meeting their gazes one by one. "We all have our own spiritual journeys. No one can force another person to believe, but if there is one thing I want to emphasize, it's this, and never be afraid to seek the truth. The truth will not change simply because we choose to ignore it." The room fell silent once again, but this time the silence was not due to tension. It was a moment of reflection. Everyone in the room was beginning to realize that this was more than just an academic debate. It was an intellectual journey that touched both the heart and mind. Dr. Eaton finally smiled slightly. "You know, if all Muslims were like you, perhaps the world would be a more peaceful place." Hazel chuckled. "I'm just a student, still learning, Professor. But I believe that if we all engage in discussions with a calm mind and an open heart, we can understand each other better. Dr. Richard stood up from his chair. All right, I think we've discussed enough for today. I'll take some time to reflect on everything you've said. The students responded with applause, not because anyone had won or lost the discussion, but because their perspectives had been expanded. Some approached Hazel eager to continue the conversation, while others engaged in discussions amongst themselves. As Hazel walked out of the lecture hall, she gazed at the evening sky, now painted in hues of orange. She knew that her journey was far from over. More questions would come, more discussions would take place, but she was certain of one thing. As long as someone sincerely seeks the truth, Allah will always guide them to the right path. This story teaches us that truth cannot be forced upon anyone. It must be sought with an open heart and a clear mind. Islam does not ask people to believe blindly. Rather, it encourages each individual to seek evidence, reflect, and understand with knowledge. Not everyone will immediately accept the truth, and that's okay. The most important thing is how we convey our message, with wisdom, patience, and noble character. As the Quran states in Surah An-Nahl 16:125, "Invite to the way of your Lord with wisdom and good instruction, and argue with them in a way that is best." May we all be individuals who continuously seek knowledge, deepen our understanding, and strive to get closer to Allah in the right way. This story reminds us that Islam is not just a religion, it is a complete way of life, full of wisdom and meaning. If we seek the truth with sincere intentions, Allah will surely guide us. Thank you for watching this video. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe so you won't miss more inspiring stories. See you in the next video.